Saipan, July 6, 1944, 2:17 hours. The island slept beneath a sky that burned faintly red from distant fires. The surf rolled in slow, uneven breaths against the black volcanic sand. Every wave carried back a whisper of death. Helmets, rifles, and the small wooden crosses that dotted the shoreline like broken teeth. Across the island's northern ridge, the Marines of the 2nd Division waited in silence. Some sat in shell holes half filled with water. Others leaned against spent ammunition crates that had become chairs, tables, even headstones. The air stank of cordite, diesel, and the sweet metallic scent of rusting blood. Down the slope, half hidden behind a sandbag wall and a curtain of camouflage netting, stood a squat, ugly structure that the men called the Brig. It was once a storage bunker, an old pre-war Japanese supply dump, but the Marines had repurposed it. Its concrete walls were pitted and charred, its doors wrapped in barbed wire and steel plates scavenged from wrecked landing craft. Inside, 40 men waited in darkness. Before we go deeper into this forgotten moment of courage, this is WW2 Frontline Legends, where real history meets the bravery that shaped it. If you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, give this story a like, and tell us where you're watching from around the world. I read every comment, and your hometown might appear in the next legend we uncover. They were Marines, but the kind the Corps pretended not to have. Drunks, brawlers, thieves, men caught gambling with enemy currency or striking an officer. Men who had crossed the line between discipline and chaos. The good Marines called them brig rats. The bad ones called them dead weight. Their keeper was Master Sergeant Henry Brig Callahan, a career Marine carved out of duty and regret. He'd served on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and half the islands that never made the papers. He wore the war like a second skin, tight, scarred, unyielding. His voice could freeze a wave mid-break. But beneath that iron tone, something burned. A memory that kept him awake long after the lights went out. For weeks, he'd been doing something strange in the Brig. After sunset, when the rest of the camp fell silent, he ordered the prisoners out into the night. Lanterns flickered like ghosts as he drilled them, crawling through trenches, running silent formations, attacking from shadows. No rhythm, no pattern, only noise and movement. He called it controlled chaos. The guards whispered that he'd lost his mind. But Callahan wasn't training for inspection. He was preparing for a day he couldn't yet name. A day when structure would fail, and chaos would be all that remained. That day arrived on the night of July 6th. At 2:43 hours, scouts stumbled through the lines with news that chilled the spine of every man awake. Thousands, perhaps 3,000, Japanese soldiers were massing in the North Valley for a final Banzai charge. It would be the largest of the Pacific campaign. A suicidal flood of bayonets and battle cries. Every Marine on Saipan knew what that meant. They were about to face a wall of men who had already chosen death. Orders crackled across field phones. Machine guns were checked, grenades stacked, mortars realigned. Then a single shell, one lucky hit, landed near the command tent and tore through the radio post. The entire northern sector went silent. The front line was now blind. In the dead zone of that blackout sat Callahan's Brig, 40 prisoners cut off without command. No relief. No orders. No chance. He stood at the bunker door, watching the horizon pulse with faint flashes. The rumble underfoot was growing. He could almost feel the ground breathing. To the west, tracer rounds lit up like fireflies as the first defensive guns opened up. Then came the answering roar, 1,000 voices screaming, "Tenno Hika Banzai." And the world broke loose. For a heartbeat, Callahan said nothing. Then he turned, walked back into the Brig, and lit a single lantern. The light wavered across faces pale with fear. He looked at them, men he'd cursed, punished, called hopeless. In that moment, they weren't criminals. They were his last platoon. "Earn your freedom," he said quietly, "or die as Marines." The keys rattled. The locks fell away. The door opened to the roar of the oncoming storm. The convicts poured out, some still dragging chains, others grabbing rifles from the dead near the wire. The first explosion blew apart the sandbags where Callahan had been standing moments before. Dirt rained down like ash. The night turned orange. Callahan moved among them like a phantom, barking orders that cut through the chaos. "Teams of 3 move. Keep changing positions. Make noise. Make them think we're everywhere." That was the secret of his madness, his controlled chaos. Instead of forming a line, he scattered them. Each group became its own storm, yelling, firing, vanishing. The Japanese advance stumbled, unsure of where the resistance was strongest. Smoke and confusion spread faster than fire. In the flicker of explosions, the Brig rats fought like men possessed. A mechanic from Detroit used a shovel when his rifle jammed. A moonshiner from Georgia threw himself on a machine gun nest and kept firing until the barrel melted. Somewhere in the dark, someone laughed, wild and free, as if the sound itself could scare the enemy back into the sea. The tide of bodies crashed against them again and again. Bayonets flashed. Grenades rolled into pits and blew the night apart. But the convicts kept moving, unpredictable, relentless. The Japanese believed they'd met a hidden battalion. Some swore they were fighting hundreds. By 3:10 hours, the ridge was hell on earth. Every inch of sand hid smoke, fire, and ghosts. But Callahan's men were still standing, and somewhere in that inferno, he found a strange calm. He'd spent his life enforcing order. Now chaos was saving them. Fade to quiet, just wind over sand. What happened next would become one of the most whispered legends of the Pacific War. A story buried under official reports and lost dispatches. And if you're watching this right now, you've just stepped into that legend. A forgotten moment when 40 broken men defied an army 3,000 strong and vanished into history almost unrecorded. Take a second to support this story so it never disappears again. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Give this video a like, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read every one, and I love seeing history lovers from every corner of the world unite to keep these forgotten heroes alive. Now, let's return to Saipan as the second wave of the Banzai charge descends, and the 40 men of the Brig face the moment that will decide whether their names live on or vanish forever. Saipan, July 6, 1944, 3:24 hours. The second wave hit like a tidal flood of steel and sound. The ridge shook beneath the feet of 3,000 men as if the island itself wanted to crawl away from the carnage. The horizon was no longer black. It pulsed with fire and the phosphorescent flicker of tracer rounds streaking low over the sand. The air was thick enough to chew salt, smoke, and the sharp tang of gun oil. Callahan's small band crouched in what had once been a drainage gully, now a scar of mud and blood. The first wave had broken against them, but this was different. This was the full fury of a cornered army. Machine guns rattled like the heartbeat of the island. Mortars flared and whined down from the hills. Every explosion dug new graves into the earth. And yet, through that storm, 40 men moved like shadows. Callahan's controlled chaos was no theory now, it was living, breathing madness. He'd scattered his convicts in jagged clusters across the ridge. Each team of 3 or 4 fought as its own small unit. Attack, vanish, circle, and strike again. No straight lines. No predictable defense. To the enemy, it looked like hundreds of Marines in motion. To Callahan, it was art in blood and smoke. The first group fired flares from behind wrecked vehicles to draw the enemy's eyes while another slipped through the dunes and hit them from the flank. Grenades rolled downhill, bursting among charging soldiers who screamed the Emperor's name as they fell. The noise became one endless roar, rifle cracks, shouts, steel on steel. One convict, once a thief from Chicago's South Side, crawled into a shell crater with a machine gun and held his ground until the barrel glowed red. Another, a kid barely 20, fired until his shoulder dislocated, then braced the stock against the dirt and kept shooting with one arm. They fought like men trying to buy back their souls. Callahan moved among them, unrecognizable beneath a mask of soot. He didn't bark orders anymore. He simply appeared where the line wavered, his presence steadier than any command. When a man faltered, he was there, his hand dragging him back into the fight. When ammunition ran out, he stripped weapons from the dead and tossed them forward. His calm was terrifying and contagious. At 3:40, the Japanese tried to regroup. Bugles shrieked across the valley, summoning formation. But there was no formation left, only confusion. Every time they gathered in numbers, Callahan's shadows hit from another direction. The hill turned into a maze of death. In that chaos, the first twist emerged. One of Callahan's runners stumbled into a shattered command post, the one that had lost radio contact earlier. Inside, under a fallen beam, the field telephone was not broken by shellfire as they'd believed. Its wires had been cut, clean, deliberate, recent. Someone had sabotaged communication before the attack. Whether it was enemy infiltration or betrayal within the ranks, no one knew. The discovery explained the blackout, but raised a darker question. Who wanted the Brig left to die alone? Callahan never had time to find out. The next charge came screaming down the slope. He gathered the convicts closer to the brig, their makeshift fortress of concrete and barbed wire. They were low on ammo, half their number wounded, but retreat wasn't in the air. They'd come too far to hide again behind walls. Callahan pointed toward the ridge and waved them forward, the gesture of a man who had stopped caring about survival. The second wave met them head-on. The impact was biblical. Bayonets clashed, rifles fired at point-blank range, and the world dissolved into chaos, so pure it seemed orchestrated by the gods of war themselves. Smoke blinded them, blood slicked the rocks, and still the 40 fought, in pairs, in trios, crawling, striking, disappearing. Callahan's tactic had turned the field into a nightmare of movement. The Japanese shouted in confusion, attacking empty trenches, firing into smoke that bit back. By 4:10, visibility dropped to nothing. The sun was still below the horizon, and the sky had turned the color of lead. From the outer positions, surviving Marines on the main line watched through binoculars. They saw flashes, heard screams, but couldn't tell who was winning. Some swore they saw hundreds of Marines out there. Others said it was just ghosts fighting ghosts. Down in the Brig Valley, Callahan's numbers were dwindling. Out of 40, maybe 20 still fought. But something strange had begun to happen. The convicts had stopped thinking about survival. They fought with an eerie, wordless unity, each man moving as if he knew where the others would be, each one covering the next without command. It wasn't discipline. It was desperation reborn as instinct. Callahan found himself beside a fallen gunner, took his weapon, and turned it toward the densest mass of enemies. He squeezed the trigger until the drum ran dry, until the recoil bruised his shoulder, until the air reeked of cordite. Every burst cut another line through the charge. And when the gun clicked empty, he switched to grenades. Pull, count, throw, each explosion carving seconds of survival. By 4:35, the enemy advance had slowed. Hundreds lay dead in front of the brig, but new silhouettes kept emerging through the smoke. The Japanese commander, believing he faced a full Marine battalion, ordered artillery from the far ridge. The shells began to fall among his own men, mistaking their position in the confusion Callahan's chaos had created. The island itself began to eat the invaders alive. Then, silence, the kind that feels heavier than any sound. Callahan looked around. The brig was burning. The air shimmered with heat. The remaining convicts huddled in shell craters, their faces blackened and hollow. Somewhere in that stillness, a bugle wailed one last defiant note before fading into the surf. The second wave had broken. Against all logic, against every manual ever written, they had held. But the cost was immense. Of 40, barely a dozen could still stand. And yet, none of them spoke of surrender. They simply reloaded from the dead, took water from canteens of men who would never drink again, and waited. Because in the distance, faint but certain, they could already hear the drums of a third wave. Callahan sat on a fallen beam near the brig's entrance, his hands shaking for the first time. The flame of his lantern flickered beside him, the same one he had lit hours earlier to free the prisoners. Its glow trembled against the carved concrete, revealing something etched there by a bayonet. "Forgive us our past." He didn't know which man had written it. Maybe they all had. At 4:55, the horizon began to lighten. The gray dawn stretched its fingers across Saipan's ridges, revealing a scene too brutal for memory. The black sands were littered with broken flags and shattered helmets. The bodies of enemy soldiers lay piled so thick the waves couldn't reach the shore. Among them, the remains of the convicts were scattered like forgotten relics. And yet, in that ruin movement, one man staggered upright, then another. They were ghosts wrapped in smoke, but they were alive. Callahan gathered them, all that was left, 12 men and one lantern. He led them back toward the line where they'd first been imprisoned. But there was no command to report to, no officer waiting. The brigade above still had no radio signal, still believed that sector lost. Then came the moment that would burn itself into the legend. A flare shot up from the opposite ridge, green, spiraling, impossible. It was the signal for position secure. No one knew who fired it. The last radio in that zone had been destroyed. But every Marine who saw it later swore it came from the Brig Valley. And when they advanced at first light, they found nothing left alive except silence, and a single set of bloody sergeant's stripes nailed to a wall. The reports that followed called it an anomaly. Command dismissed it as confusion, a fluke of overlapping units. No mention of convicts. No mention of Callahan. Just a notation. Enemy Banzai charge repelled, estimated casualties, 3,000. But word spread in the camps. Some said they'd seen the Brig rats, walking the ridge at dawn, rifles on their shoulders, vanishing into the jungle like ghosts. Others said they'd heard laughter carried by the wind, low, tired, and free. And somewhere, in the ruins of that bunker, carved into blackened stone, the second half of that message appeared later, scratched in shaky letters. For we paid it forward. The story of the 40 convicts became rumor, then myth. A tale passed between foxholes and mess halls, half believed, half doubted. But decades later, when an archaeologist team surveyed the northern ridge, they uncovered fragments of helmets and a rusted tag stamped H. Callahan, USMC. How it got there, miles from the reported line, no one could explain. Saipan, July 7, 1944, 6:30 hours. Dawn came softly to a battlefield that no longer breathed. The first light touched the black sand and found only stillness, a calm so wrong it hurt to look at. Smoke drifted from shattered palm trees. Craters shimmered with heat. Rifles stuck out of the ground like broken crosses, and the sea whispered the same question the wind had been asking all night. Who survived? The Marines from the southern sector moved cautiously up the ridge, stepping over bodies, eyes darting toward the horizon. They expected resistance. Instead, they found ghosts. The Japanese charge was gone, crushed, scattered, burned out in the night. There was no organized retreat, no survivors fleeing to the caves. Only silence and the faint smell of fuel. When the first squad reached the Brig Valley, what they saw made no sense. The bunker was half collapsed, its roof blown open, its walls clawed by explosions. The barbed wire had melted in places, fused into black shapes like veins of glass. Around it lay hundreds of enemy bodies, men who had died facing the wrong direction, as if they'd turned at the last second to run. But there were no Marines among them. No 40 convicts. No Callahan. Just footprints leading toward the jungle. They followed the tracks for nearly half a mile before they vanished into swamp and vines. No blood trails. No bodies. It was as if the men had stepped off the face of the earth. When the reports reached headquarters, the colonel in command refused to believe them. Communications had been down the entire night. No one had issued orders to that sector. Officially, there had been no Marine presence beyond the ridge after 200 hours. Yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. 3,000 Japanese soldiers dead in a killing zone supposedly abandoned. The colonel's final report was clinical. Enemy Banzai charge repelled under unknown circumstances. No friendly casualties recovered. Investigation pending. But among the men who saw the field that morning, the story took on another shape. They spoke of phantom movements in the smoke, of hearing gunfire long after it should have ended, of voices shouting Marine codes from the dark. Some swore they saw a lantern moving along the ridge just before sunrise, swaying, steady, leading the way toward the jungle. They began calling it Callahan's Light. For weeks, search parties combed the northern valley. They found fragments, an empty ammo belt here, a boot print hardened in clay, a rusted dog tag stamped USMC. But never a body. And then one day, a squad stumbled upon something strange. An enemy field journal, half burned, buried under a fallen soldier. Its author was a Japanese lieutenant. His last entry was dated the same night the charge had failed. It read, "We fought demons tonight. They moved like smoke, screamed like madmen, vanished before we could strike. We fired until our guns were hot, and the darkness still screamed back. They were not soldiers. They were punishment." The journal ended there. The Marines brought it back to base, and the interpreter's translation spread through the camp like wildfire. But when it reached the command desk, it disappeared. Officially, it never existed. Months later, as Saipan was secured and new campaigns began, the story of Callahan and his 40 vanished men slipped into rumor. A legend for those who stayed awake on guard duty, a ghost story told under the stars. But it never fully died. Years passed. The war ended. Men returned home. Others didn't. The Pacific became quiet again. The jungle on Saipan grew over the scars of battle, covering bunkers and trenches in green. In 1952, a Navy survey team clearing old munitions on the island stumbled across the remnants of a concrete bunker near the northern cliffs. Inside, buried under soil and coral growth, they found a single Marine helmet, rusted through but still legible. The name stamped inside the rim read, H. Callahan. Next to it was something stranger, a fragment of a map drawn in charcoal on the bunker wall. It showed the ridgeline of Saipan with several paths marked by symbols that no one could identify. Some historians later claimed the symbols resembled old Marine field signals for ambush and misdirection, exactly the kind Callahan had been teaching his prisoners before the attack. The discovery reignited the legend. Was it possible that Callahan had survived the charge? That he'd led his surviving men deep into enemy lines, continuing the fight long after the official battle was over? Some believed he'd turned his chaos into guerrilla warfare, harassing the enemy from the jungle until the end of the campaign. Others said he'd gone mad, unable to return, choosing instead to vanish with the men the world had already forgotten. No records were ever found to confirm either story. The Marine Corps officially listed him as Kia, killed in action, though no remains were ever recovered. Still, among veterans who fought on Saipan, a few swore they'd seen him months later, in the distance, a tall figure in a torn uniform, standing on the ridge at dusk, watching the horizon. When they called out, he turned and disappeared into the trees. They called him the Last Warden. The legend deepened further in the 1970s when an archaeological dig on the island unearthed a small metal plate under coral rock near the old Brig site. It bore one simple engraving, weathered but clear. "Forgive us our past, for we paid it forward." The same words that had once been scratched into the Brig wall. To this day, no one knows who wrote them, or when. The story of Master Sergeant Henry "Brick" Callahan remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Pacific War. No after-action report mentions him. No medal citation carries his name. And yet, across decades, fragments of his legend refuse to die. Some call it myth. Others say it's the truest kind of history, the kind that lives only in whispers because it speaks to what men can become when stripped of everything else. Because in that night of chaos, 40 broken men found redemption not in orders, not in glory, but in the fire of defiance. They turned punishment into salvation. Maybe that's why historians still argue over what happened on Saipan's northern ridge. Maybe that's why veterans, when they hear the name Callahan, simply nod, as if remembering something they once saw but promised never to speak of. One Marine from the 2nd Division, interviewed decades later, said this: "You can erase names from reports. You can lose files. But when men do something that shouldn't be possible, the island remembers. The ground remembers. And maybe that's what Saipan did. It remembered. When the ocean winds blow across those ridges at night, locals say you can still hear faint echoes, rifle bursts carried on the air, boots crunching in the sand, a single voice shouting orders no one understands. And sometimes, when the moon is low, a light flickers among the palm trees, just one, moving slow, steady, unafraid. They call it Callahan's light. No one follows it. No one dares. But those who see it never forget. This was the story of a man the records forgot, and of 40 outcasts who proved that courage doesn't come from rank, uniform, or reputation. It comes from the choice to stand your ground when the world has already written you off. Maybe that's the real legacy of Callahan's secret tactic. Not how it worked, but why it mattered. Because in the darkest hour, when command failed and reason vanished, he didn't wait for orders. He gave 40 condemned men one final chance to earn back their humanity. And they took it. If this story reached you tonight, if it reminded you that even in the chaos of history there are moments of redemption worth remembering, then you are part of keeping that memory alive. Before you go, take a moment. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Give this story a like, and tell me where you're watching from around the world in the comments. I read every one of them, and I love seeing how far these forgotten legends travel. Your comment, your share, your voice, they keep these stories alive for the next generation who might never know that courage sometimes wears the face of the forgotten. So if stories like this move you, stories of ordinary men who did the impossible, then make sure you stay with us here on WW2 Frontline Legends. Because the next forgotten tale might just be the one that changes how you see the war forever.